Astral Sleep Stories. Welcome back to Astral Sleep Stories, the place where you come to let everything go, to breathe a little slower, to sink a little deeper, and to let the night carry you somewhere soft and warm and far away from the noise of the day. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Whether you've had a long and heavy day, or simply a quiet one that left you a little restless, you've made the right choice by being here now. Tonight, we're going somewhere very special, somewhere that will feel, from the very first moment, like stepping in from the cold. So go ahead and settle in. Let your body find the position it's been wanting all evening, the one your muscles have been quietly asking for. Loosen your shoulders if they've crept upward. Unclench your jaw. Let your hands rest open and easy at your sides. There is nothing you need to hold on to right now. Nothing at all. Take a slow breath in through your nose. Let it fill you all the way down, past your chest, into your belly. Hold it there for just a moment, and then let it go, completely and without hurry, like smoke rising from a warm fire on a cold night. Do that once more. Breathe in slowly and out. With each exhale, feel yourself pressing just a little more gently into wherever you're resting. The weight of your limbs becomes something pleasant, something reassuring, like the weight of a thick quilt on a winter evening. Tonight's story is called The Hearthkeeper's Tale. It begins in a place that exists in that soft country between memory and dream. A mountain village so small, so tucked away between ancient peaks that most maps never bothered to record it. But the people who lived there knew it well. They knew every creaking floorboard and every stone step. They knew the smell of the bakery at dawn and the particular music that the wind made when it threaded through the pines along the ridge. And they knew, above all else, the glow of the Great Hearth, that ancient, enormous fireplace at the center of the village square, which had never, in all the memory of anyone living or anyone who had ever lived there, gone dark. The village was called Valdemar. It sat in a wide, shallow valley, cradled between two mountain ranges that rose on either side like the shoulders of sleeping giants. The peaks were old, older than the village, older than the roads that wound up toward it, older than the names the people had given them. They were capped in snow for most of the year, and even in late summer, when the wild flowers bloomed in the meadows and the days ran long and golden, you could look up and see that white glittering crown against the blue sky, a permanent reminder that winter was always waiting patiently just above. The village itself was small enough that everyone knew everyone. There were perhaps 200 people, maybe a few more if you counted the farms that dotted the hillsides beyond the main cluster of buildings. The houses were built close together, their walls of pale stone and their roofs of dark timber. And in the winter months when the snow came in thick and the paths between them narrowed to tunnels of packed white, the buildings seemed to press even closer, like a group of friends huddling together against the cold. Every house had its own fireplace, of course. Every kitchen had its stove, every bedroom its small iron grate. But the heart of all that warmth, the source that the villagers trusted most deeply and spoke about with a reverence usually reserved for something sacred, was the Great Hearth. It stood in the center of the main square, housed within a low stone structure that had been built and rebuilt and added onto over so many generations that no one could say with any certainty when it had first been constructed. The hearth itself was enormous, wide enough that 4 people could stand inside its arch without touching the sides. deep enough that the back wall was always in a kind of pleasant shadow. The stones around it were darkened with centuries of smoke, worn smooth by countless hands that had reached toward its warmth, and carved in a few places with old symbols that no one alive could quite read anymore, though there were still people in the village who claimed their grandparents had known what they meant. The fire inside never went out. That was the thing that everyone in Valdemar knew and accepted as simply a fact of their world, the way they accepted that the mountains were tall or that the river was cold. The Great Hearth burned. It burned in summer and winter, through storms and long, calm weeks of early autumn, through the deep, frozen midnights of January, and the pale, sleepy mornings of late March. It burned when the oldest person in the village was born, and it burned when she died at 94, and it had been burning long before her, and would presumably go on burning long after every single person currently alive in Valdemar had come and gone. The fire was not dramatic. It was not a roaring, crackling blaze that leapt and threw sparks into the sky. It was something quieter and more constant than that. A deep, settled burning, the kind that has moved through its early excitement and found its rhythm, low and steady and warm. The logs at its base glowed a deep amber red, and above them the flames moved slowly in long, unhurried shapes, reaching upward and folding back and reaching again. The light it cast was golden, not bright. It would not have kept you from sleep, but warm in a way that made every shadow in the square feel soft rather than dark. And there was always someone tending it. The Hearthkeeper's name, at the time of this story, was Maren. She had held the position for 31 years, which meant she had taken it over at the age of 42, and she was now 73 years old, and had no intention of stopping anytime soon. Before her, the role had been held by a man named Ott, who had kept the hearth for 22 years before his knees decided they had climbed enough stone steps in the dark to last several lifetimes. And before Ott, a woman named Thessaly, whose tenure stretched back so far that the oldest residents of Valdemar could only tell you things about her second hand, things their parents had told them, things with the quality of stories more than memories. The Hearthkeeper did not live in a grand house. The role came with a small dwelling built right against the side of the hearth structure, one room and a loft, with a kitchen no bigger than a generous closet, and a window that looked out directly onto the square. The house was always warm, which was perhaps its greatest luxury. Even in the deepest cold of February, when the rest of the village all sat in their coats indoors and pressed their feet close to their grates, Maren's little house held its warmth with a quiet confidence. The stone wall she shared with the hearth never lost the heat it absorbed throughout the day. At night, it was like sleeping beside a great and gentle animal. She rose before dawn every morning without fail, not because she needed an alarm or a knock at her door. After 31 years, her body had simply decided that the hour before first light was her natural time. She would dress in the dark with easy, practiced movements, pull on her heavy wool coat and her thick-soled boots, wrap a scarf of deep burgundy around her neck, and step out into the square. The square was always silent at that hour. In winter, it was also white. The snow that fell overnight lay undisturbed on the cobblestones, and her boots would make the first marks in it, crossing toward the hearth in a straight line. The fire would have been burning all night, of course, tended through the darkness by whichever of her two assistants was on the night watch. But still, Maren liked to see it herself. She liked the way it looked in those minutes before dawn, the deep orange glow of it against the blue-black sky. the faint column of smoke rising in an almost perfectly straight line upward. When the air was still, the way the warmth from it reached out and touched her face when she drew close, like a greeting. She would add logs, 3 of them, selected with care from the wood piles stacked under the stone overhang. The logs came from the forest on the eastern slope, where a rotating section was harvested each year by the village's woodcutters, who understood which trees to take and which to leave, and left the forest in better shape, season by season, than they found it. The logs Maren chose were dense and dry, the kind that would burn long and steadily rather than hot and fast. She placed them one at a time, arranged them with a practiced touch so that the air could circulate between them. And then she stood for a moment and watched the flames find their way around this new fuel, tasting it, deciding on it, accepting it. Then she would turn and make her first round of the village. Tonight was the 2nd week of December. The snow had come early this year. It had arrived in the last days of October, a shy, uncertain dusting that melted by mid-morning, then returned more seriously in early November, and finally settled in for good on the 15th of that month, blanketing the valley in a thick white quiet that everyone in Valdemar recognized as the true beginning of winter. By now, the world above the tree line was entirely white. The lower slopes of the mountains were white. The rooftops of the village were white and rounded with accumulated snow, and the paths between the houses had been shoveled clear, but would need shoveling again by morning. The temperature tonight was the kind that had a texture to it, sharp and clean when you breathed it in, cold enough to make your breath visible, cold enough to make the snow underfoot compress with a soft creak beneath each step. But it was not the brutal, dangerous cold that sometimes came in January and February, the kind that got into your bones and stayed there. Tonight's cold was brisk and honest, and if you were dressed properly, and Maren always was, it was actually rather pleasant. It made the world feel defined, clear. She walked slowly. That was the thing people noticed most about Maren, those who watched her on her evening rounds, the absolute absence of hurry. She moved through the village the way the fire moved through its logs, at the pace that was exactly right for the task, neither slow from laziness nor fast from anxiety, but simply at the proper speed of a thing that has found its rhythm. Her boots made quiet sounds on the packed snow. Her breath came in small, even puffs that dissolved into the dark air above her. She carried a lantern, a small old thing with a glass panel on 3 sides and a handle worn smooth with years of use, though the lantern was somewhat redundant on clear nights like this one, when the stars overhead were bright enough to cast faint shadows and the snow on the ground reflected even starlight back upward in a diffuse and gentle glow. The first house she passed was the Brennan family's, a wide stone cottage set slightly back from the square, with a low fence around a garden that was buried in snow now, but which in summer grew the most extraordinary collection of herbs that Maren had ever seen. The Brennans had 4 children, and every window in the cottage was dark. She paused for a moment and looked at the faint glow from the chimney, that thin thread of smoke, satisfied that their fire was burning well and the family were warm in their beds. She moved on. She passed the bakery, where the Groth brothers would be rising in less than 4 hours to begin the first bake of the day. She passed the schoolhouse with its bell tower and its wide, dark windows. She passed the inn, where 2 or 3 of the upper windows still glowed faintly amber. Travelers, perhaps, or locals who kept late hours, though there were few enough of those in Valdemar in December. She passed the small chapel at the edge of the square, with its stone steps swept clean of snow and its door painted a very particular shade of dark blue that looked almost black at night, At each lantern post she paused, checked the flame, trimmed the wick if it needed it. The village had 14 lantern posts in total, and Maren knew each of them the way she knew her own fingers. Which one had a catch on its glass panel? Which one stood at a slight lean? Which one threw a particular oval of warm light that she had always found especially beautiful? When all 14 were burning, the village glowed with a warm, low, connected light, like a living thing settled contentedly into its own warmth for the night.
She saved the windowsills for Lars. Oh.
This was a tradition she had started in her second year as Hearthkeeper, after a particularly bitter winter storm had piled snow against the fronts of the houses so quickly that by morning, several families had found their doors blocked by drifted snow. Nothing dangerous, but inconvenient and cold, and the kind of thing that could be prevented. Now, on nights when snow was falling, or likely to fall overnight, Maren made a point of walking the length of each inhabited building and using a long-handled wooden brush to clear the snow from the windowsills, pushing it gently aside so that the frames would not bow or the windows stick with ice by morning. It was a small thing. Most of the people whose windows she cleared never knew she had done it. They simply woke to find their windows clear, their mornings a little easier, without ever needing to know why. Tonight, she worked her way carefully down the long row of houses on the western side of the square, clearing each sill with easy strokes, stepping back occasionally to look up at a window and confirm all was well within. Some houses were entirely dark, families long asleep. Others had the faint, warm glow of a banked fire behind shuttered windows, sending thin lines of amber light out into the snow. One house, near the end of the row, had a candle still burning in what she knew was the children's room. The Volk family's youngest, who was 6 years old and had recently gone through a period of being afraid of the dark. Maren smiled to herself at the sight of that small, steady candle flame. She lingered for a moment on the eastern side of the square, where the oldest houses stood, their stone walls so thick that no cold could find its way through, their roots deep in the ground of this valley. These houses had stood here for 200 years, some of them perhaps longer. Generations of the same families had been born in them, had cooked in their kitchens, had sat at their tables through long winter evenings, had looked out their windows at this very square, at this very hearth, at this very fire. It was a thought that Maren had often and never tired of. The continuity of it. The quiet persistence of warmth passed from hand to hand, down through the years. She finished her round and made her way back across the square to the hearth. She stood before the fire for a long time. This was the part of the evening she loved most. Not the rounds, useful and satisfying as they were, but this, the return to the hearth, the standing before it at the hour when the village was fully asleep and the square was entirely hers, when there was nothing in the world but the fire and the dark and the cold and the stars overhead. She let the warmth reach her face and her hands. She breathed it in. The smell of burning wood was one she had lived alongside for so long that she no longer noticed it consciously the way she once had. But it was still there, still present beneath every breath she took in this place, rich and dark and faintly sweet, the particular smell of dense mountain timber burning slowly through a cold night. She sat down on the wide stone bench that curved around the front of the hearth. The stone was warm beneath her, which was always a small and reliable delight. It was tonight, at this hour, sitting in this way, that she noticed the fire doing something she had not quite seen before. The glow was a little different. She could not have said precisely how, not brighter exactly, or hotter. But there was a quality to the light that seemed changed, as though something in the character of the fire had shifted just slightly, the way a voice shifts when it is about to say something important. The flames moved in their usual slow, unhurried way, but there seemed to be a depth to the amber and gold of them that was new, or perhaps simply more visible tonight than most. A richness, a kind of presence. Maren watched it for a while without moving. She had heard the old stories, of course. Everyone in Valdemar had. The story that the Great Hearth was not simply old, but ancient, in a way that went beyond any human record. That it had been burning before the village had been built around it, before the first stone was laid, before the first family had made their home in this valley. The story that the fire carried something within it that was older than fire itself, some quality that was not quite magic and not quite memory, but lived somewhere between the two. The story that on certain special nights, nobody had ever been able to say which nights or why, or according to what schedule, the fire would change in some small but unmistakable way, and that this change was a sign that something good was coming. Not something dramatic, not salvation from disaster, or the answer to a great question. Just something good, something warm. She leaned a little closer to the hearth and felt the warmth intensify slightly on her face. And for a moment she felt something she had not felt in years. The particular sensation of being about to be told a story. The feeling of leaning in. The feeling of the whole world going quiet, so that something could be heard. And there, alone in the square, with the fire glowing in its new and gentle way, and the stars spread overhead, and the whole village breathing softly in its sleep all around her, Maren began to remember. She remembered the first winter she had spent as Hearthkeeper. She had been 42 that year, not young, but not old either. A person who had lived enough to know something about the world, but not enough to have stopped being surprised by it. She had been a carpenter before the role found her, good with her hands, good at reading the grain of wood and knowing how it wanted to be shaped. She had thought, when old Ott had asked her to take over from him, that tending the hearth would feel somewhat similar to carpentry, that it would be a craft, a skill, something you learned with your hands and your eyes, and gradually mastered until it became second nature. She had not been wrong, but she had also not been entirely right. The craft part came quickly enough. Within a year, she knew the hearth the way she knew her own body, its needs and its rhythms, the way it behaved in different weather, the way the draw changed when the wind came from the north versus the west, the way the fire settled differently in deep cold than in mild cold, the particular sound the wood made when it had caught properly versus when it was still deciding. She learned all of this through attentive observation, through asking good questions, through the many long hours she spent simply sitting with the fire and watching it, the way you might watch someone you are just getting to know, learning the subtle language of their expressions. But what she had not anticipated, what Ott had tried to tell her, and which she had heard but not yet understood, was how the role would change the way she moved through the world. It happened slowly. It happened in the way that most meaningful changes happen, which is to say without drama or announcement, without any single moment she could point to afterward and say, that was when it shifted. But over the course of that first year, and then the years that followed, she noticed that she had become different in some quality she could not quite name. More patient, more attentive, more present in each moment, in a way that didn't feel like effort, just like the natural state of a person who has spent thousands of hours with something that demands your full attention or reveals nothing. The fire had a way of refusing to be rushed or managed or forced. It did what it did at its own pace and according to its own logic. You could tend it, you could add fuel and arrange the logs and adjust the draw. But you could not control it, not truly. It was always, at its core, its own thing. And there was something in coming to terms with that, in learning to work with rather than over, that had changed her in ways she was still discovering. By her 5th year, she had begun to feel that the role was not something she did, but something she was. By her 10th, she had stopped distinguishing between Maren the person and Maren the Hearthkeeper, because there was no longer any meaningful distinction to make. They were the same. She was a woman whose purpose was warmth, not just the warmth of the fire, but warmth in the broader sense, the human sense, the sense in which you can make a place feel safer simply by being in it. She thought about this now, sitting before the glowing hearth in the December silence, and she thought about the village asleep all around her, and she thought about the children in their warm beds. The Brennan children and the Volk children and the baker's apprentice who had come from a village 3 valleys over, and who still, after 2 years, sometimes looked a little uncertain, a little far from home, in the way that young people can look when they are not yet sure they belong somewhere. She thought about the way warmth moves. It moves outward, always. That was the nature of it. It begins somewhere, at some source, and then it moves outward in all directions, passing through walls and wood and stone, diffusing into the air, reaching into every space it can find. It does not choose to move. It does not decide that this corner deserves warmth, and that corner does not. It simply moves, following the law of its own nature, until it has spread as far as it can spread. And in doing so, it makes everything it touches a little closer to the same temperature as the thing it came from. This was, when she thought about it carefully, also the nature of kindness. Kindness moves outward. It starts somewhere, in one person, in one moment, in one decision to add something good to the world, rather than taking something away. And then it moves, diffusing through interactions and conversations and small, unnamed gestures, until it has reached places no one intended it to reach, has warmed things no one thought to warm. You could not always trace it back to its source. Sometimes you could not even see it moving. But it moved. The fire crackled softly, a small and perfect sound in the stillness. She had been told this story once, or not told it exactly, but shown it in her 14th year as Hearthkeeper. It had been a difficult winter, one of the hardest in recent memory, and a family on the edge of the village. 3 children, a mother who was unwell, a father who was working himself to exhaustion trying to keep everything together, had been struggling in ways that the rest of the village was only beginning to understand. It was the kind of struggle that is often invisible, that hides behind a face trained to look fine, that does not announce itself. Maren had noticed. She had noticed in the particular way that people notice things when their attention has been trained by years of careful watching. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a quiet, certain accumulation of small signs. The father's coat was thinner than it should have been for that kind of winter. The children, when she saw them in the square, had a look of sustained effort about them, the look of people who were working hard at something just to keep up. Their chimney produced less smoke than it should have, which meant their fire was smaller than it should have been. She said nothing to anyone. She simply began, quietly, to do things. She arranged for extra logs to appear at their door. Left in the night, and attributed to no one. She spoke to the baker, and the baker began putting aside the second loaves, the ones that would otherwise be left at the end of the day, and these too appeared at the family's door. She mentioned to a few neighbors, in the most natural and unhurried way, that the family might appreciate a visit, might appreciate the kind of company that involves sitting at a kitchen table and not asking too many questions. And these things happened, and the family received them, and the winter passed, and by spring the mother's health had improved, and the father's exhaustion had lifted slightly, and life found its way back to something easier. No one had named what had happened. No announcement had been made. No gratitude had been formally expressed. The warmth had simply moved from person to person, through the village, and done what warmth does. The fire deepened in color as she sat there, moving slowly toward a deeper amber, and the light it cast seemed to settle around her like something solid, like a room inside the room, something bounded and contained and very, very warm. She was not cold at all now. She was the precise temperature of comfort, the temperature that makes you feel your limbs go heavy, and your thoughts go slow, and your eyelids begin to want things they haven't wanted in hours. She thought about the mountain. There was one in particular that she could see from the square on clear days, the tallest of the range to the east, which the villagers called the Old One, not because it was older than the others. They were all old, unspeakably old, geologically ancient, beyond any human concept of age. But because it looked oldest, because its face had a quality of having seen things that the other peaks had not, it was the first mountain to catch the morning light and the last to release the evenings. In winter, its summit gleamed white against whatever color the sky was holding, and in storms, it was the last thing to disappear into cloud, as though it was reluctant to let itself be obscured. She had climbed it once, long ago, before she was the Hearthkeeper, before she was old enough to know what cold really meant. She and a friend, a girl named Isa, whose family had eventually moved to the larger town down in the valley, whom she still thought of sometimes with the particular warmth of people who knew you when you were young enough not to know yourself yet. They had climbed together on a day in late summer, when the snow had retreated far enough that the trail was mostly clear. It had taken them nearly 7 hours to reach the summit, and they had arrived in the late afternoon, when the light was going golden and long across the high world above the tree line, and they had stood there in that tilted, slanting light and looked out at the whole of everything. From up there, the valley looked impossibly small. Valdemar was a collection of toy buildings, a scatter of pale stone barely visible beneath the trees. The river was a thread of silver. The fields were patches of brown and late summer gold, and the whole thing was ringed by mountains, the ranges going back and back and back into the distance, each one a little paler and hazier than the last, until the farthest ones were barely distinguishable from the sky. And there, at the center of that tiny scatter of buildings so far below, too far to see but entirely possible to imagine, the hearth, burning, warm. She had not been the Hearthkeeper then. She had not yet made that promise. But she had stood up there in the cold summit wind and looked down at the village and felt something that she would only understand, years later, as belonging. Not to a place exactly, though there was that too, but to something larger and quieter, to the idea of warmth as a thing worth tending, to the idea of care as something that can be made into a life. The night was very still now. There was no wind, or almost none, just the faintest occasional breath of it, moving across the square and lifting a small curl of snow from the edge of a rooftop spinning it briefly in the air before letting it settle back. The temperature had dropped a degree or two since she had sat down, but she was warm and had no desire to move. Above her, the stars were extraordinary. The particular stellar display that December produces in a place with no competing light, no city glow anywhere near the horizon. The band of stars at the center of the galaxy stretched from one end of the sky to the other in a pale, soft sweep, and scattered across it were the brighter individual stars that even someone with no knowledge of astronomy recognizes as old and familiar friends. She traced them with her eyes, as she often did on these clear nights. Orion rising in the east, his belt an exact and perfect horizontal line. The Pleiades, that small, tight cluster that looks, depending on the night and the eye, like a tiny smudged thumbprint on the dark, visible near the constellation of Taurus, who was also there, with the reddish Aldebaran marking his eye. Cassiopeia, the queen, with her distinctive zigzag shape, high in the north. And there, very bright and very steady in the southwestern sky, a particular star that she had looked up once and learned was actually a planet, but which she thought of simply as the warm one, the one that seemed to throw back more light than it received, the one that felt, even from this impossible distance, somehow related to fire. She thought about how the light from those stars had traveled to reach her eyes tonight, even from the nearest ones. From the stars a few light years away, the light had been traveling for years to arrive at this moment, at this cold December square, at these particular eyes belonging to this particular old woman who tended a hearth in a small mountain village whose name appeared on no map. The light from the more distant stars had been traveling longer still. Some of it had left its source before this village existed, before the first human hand had shaped the first stone of these buildings, before any of the generations of Hearthkeepers who had preceded her had been born. And it arrived here now, tonight, on time, as though it had always been heading here. She thought that there was something in this worth sitting with, the way things travel toward their destination without knowing they are traveling, the way warmth moves toward cold without deciding to, the way kindness finds the people who need it, sometimes without anyone planning the route. Sometime later, she was not sure how much later, because she had drifted in her thoughts the way you drift in water when you have learned how to float. She reached into the deep pocket of her coat and brought out a small notebook. This was another tradition, older than the windowsill clearing, older than almost anything else in her tenure. She had begun it in her very first month as Hearthkeeper, on the advice of Ott, who had pressed the first blank notebook into her hands, along with all the practical instructions, and had said, simply, "Write things down." She had asked him what things, and he had said, "Anything that seems worth keeping." And she had taken him at his word. By now there were 31 notebooks, each one filled from cover to cover in her careful, slightly slanted hand. They were arranged on a shelf in her little house, and she had not made a habit of rereading them. They were not diaries exactly, not records of events in the ordinary sense. They were more like a collection of things noticed, the temperature on a particular morning, the way a certain kind of cloud formed above the eastern peak, the name of a traveler who had stopped at the hearth for warmth, and the story they had told while warming their hands, the number of swallows nesting in the eaves of the schoolhouse in a given summer, the particular quality of the light on the day the first snow fell. Small things, things that seemed individually too slight to matter, but which accumulated over the course of 31 years into something that felt very much like a portrait of a place, A record not of its history, exactly, but of its texture, its character, the specific way it felt to be alive inside it. Tonight she wrote about the fire. She wrote about the way the light had changed this evening, deepened and enriched and made more present. And she wrote about sitting here afterward, letting the warmth do what warmth does. She wrote about the mountain and the stars and the children asleep in the village around her. And she wrote about the way she understood, tonight perhaps more clearly than usual, that the tending of this hearth was not simply a job or a role or even a calling, but a conversation. A conversation between a person and a fire that had been burning longer than either of them had names, and that would go on burning after both of them were gone, and that said, in the particular language of warmth and light and steady presence, the one thing it had always been trying to say. You are not alone in the cold. You have never been alone in the cold. She closed the notebook, tucked it back into her pocket. She added 2 more logs to the fire, placed with care, and stood for a moment, watching the flames find their way around the new fuel, reaching and folding and reaching. She breathed in the warmth and the wood smoke and the cold, clean air and the faint smell of snow. She looked up at the stars one last time. Then she turned and walked to the door of her little house and went inside and hung her coat and her scarf and climbed the narrow stairs to the loft where her bed was and lay down under the thick quilts and listened to the village breathing around her. The creak of a timber settling in the cold, the faint whisper of wind finding its way between the peaks, and beneath all of it, barely audible, but always present, the soft and steady voice of the great hearth burning on. And now, as you listen, imagine that you can hear it too. Imagine that wherever you are right now, in your bed, in the dark, wrapped in whatever warmth you have wrapped yourself in tonight, you are not so far from Valdemar, not so far from the square, and the lanterns, and the deep December sky full of stars. Imagine that the warmth you feel around you right now is not so different from the warmth of that fire, that same quality of settled, reliable, ancient warmth that has been burning somewhere in the world since before anyone thought to name it. Feel it at your back, beneath you. Feel it at your face, your hands, your feet. The warmth is already there, wherever you are. It was there before you noticed it. It will be there when you stop noticing it again, when your thoughts go slower and softer and begin to dissolve into the easy dark. Maren is asleep now, in her warm loft, listening to the hearth through the shared stone wall. Her breathing is slow and deep. Her hands are open on the quilt. The last thing she saw before she closed her eyes was the faint glow through the single small window that looks out onto the square, the reflection of the hearth's light against the snow, warm gold against winter white, steady and unfailing. The fire is still burning. It will be burning when she wakes, just before dawn, and steps out into the blue dark morning to begin another round. It will be burning when the Brennan children wake and press their faces against the frosted glass to look out at the square. It will be burning when the baker's apprentice hurries past the square in the cold morning, breath visible, hands tucked into his pockets, and stops for just a moment at the warmth of the hearth before continuing on, carrying a little of that warmth with him into the rest of his day. The fire burns, the village sleeps, the stars move cloudy in their ancient courses overhead. And you are warm, you are safe. You have nothing you need to do right now, but breathe slowly and let the night carry you further in, deeper down, into the soft country where there is no cold, and no weight and no urgency, only warmth and rest, and the quiet knowledge that somewhere, in a village between two mountain ranges whose names have long since been forgotten, a fire is burning for you. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts become as soft as snow settling onto a rooftop, not landing with any weight, just resting gently, quietly, without making a sound. You do not need to hold any thought for long tonight. Let them come and let them go, the way the smoke from the Great Hearth rises and disperses into the cold, clear air, leaving no trace. You are drifting now. The warmth is all around you. The fire is tended. The village is well. Sleep. Thank you so much for spending this evening with us here at Astral Sleep Stories. If tonight's visit to Valdemar brought you some peace, some warmth, some welcome quiet, please consider leaving us a like, because it truly helps more people find their way to these stories. And if you'd like to return to Valdemar or travel somewhere else entirely, a foggy harbor town, a library in the middle of an endless forest, a train moving slowly through snow-covered mountains. Subscribe so you'll know when the next story is ready and waiting for you. Rest well, tonight and always. We'll see you next time.